So welcome to our latest edition of In the Kitchen, and today I'm joined by Professor Alex Johnstone of the Rowe Institute, and making their inaugural debuts on the podcast is our award-winning chef, Orry Shand, and Director of Procurement, Barry Knight. So Alex, Orry and Barry, welcome.
Thank you. Morning.
Morning. In this episode today, we are going to explore environmentally sustainable and healthy eating approaches, which is very aptly timed given that COP28 is currently underway in the UAE. So before we get started, Alex, I was just wondering if you were able to explain a bit more about sustainable eating and why it is important for the people and the planet.
So a sustainable diet is really important because we have a growing population on the planet and we need to produce enough food to support that population, and that means the requirements for food will increase. So we need to think about how to produce enough food to support health, and also it has a health dimension in that we need to promote healthy eating to reduce the risk of disease. So sustainable diets really have two dimensions. It's having enough food to feed the planet, having enough food to feed a healthy population, but without having impact on our environment. And that is because food and the food system contributes towards the production of greenhouse gas. Yeah. And those emissions impact on the ozone layer, and that increases temperature within our climate. And that has negative consequences. As you said, that will be extensively discussed at COP in terms of ways to mitigate the harmful impact on our environment.
And Orry, I was wondering, for our listeners and viewers today, are you able to give a bit of an overview of your role here at Entier, and then having listened to Alex in terms of how you incorporate that in your day-to-day job when you're looking at sustainability for food options?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So my day-to-day role is I look after a production kitchen here in West Hill. We service a lot of different business units, nurseries, schools. We also do some sort of delivered services. We do some small events out of here, as the majority is done down at Wildtime. I also involved in some apprenticeship training with our fresh olives, as well as accrediting the MLC courses that we hold as well.
And just asking, just for anyone that might not know what an MLC course is, are you able to just explain a bit more what that stands for?
It's basically a requirement for working sort of at sea, whether it's on a yacht or on a vessel.
Okay.
And it's like almost like a competency course to sort of say, that you can do these sort of tasks that you would expect a chef to be able to do. I think that's sort of to mitigate, maybe anyone being able to sort of go on a boat and sort of say they're a chef and do that, because obviously when you're at sea, you're at sea and there's not much else you can do. So it is basically, a competency course and making sure that people can do what they say they can do, sort of thing.
And how, in your day-to-day role then, so thinking about sustainability and what Alex is saying, about the impact food has on the ozone layer, how much does that play a part in the menus that you are designing or for our clients?
Yeah,
I
guess it's finding the balance, because it's like sort of, you want to meet the demands of the client and what people actually are wanting to eat, but also trying to educate and maybe not have so much, for instance, like a lot of meat in dishes, have more sort of vegetable based dishes as well. And the sourcing of that as well, obviously we rely on sort of like Barry and the purchasing team to be able to sort of bring us like producers and suppliers that can obviously supply in a sustainable way. And as far as our packaging is concerned, especially for our retail side of things, we have recently almost moved the entire lot to vegware, which is obviously compostable. So that saves things going into like landfill or recycling, etc. It is difficult because obviously there's a cost involved in that as well. So it's, again, you need to discuss with people, you need them to be willing to sort of get on board as well because of the cost to implement.
Okay, so Orry, you touched on Barry. So Barry, are you able to maybe give a bit of an introduction to your role and then some of the methodologies that you look to implement in Entier's supply chain to ensure that long-term environmental sustainable approach to the produce and products that we use?
Yeah, sure. So as Director of Procurement for Entier, involved obviously in all areas of procurement, but clearly the business that Entier is, a very high proportion of that and focuses on food. So obviously we work very much with local suppliers as much as possible within Entier. So the brief is really clear from the top down, which makes my job really easy because, as Orry says, sometimes the decisions that you make to work with more sustainable suppliers and maybe working with higher quality or plant-based, it can be more expensive, but obviously our focus is always on buying the best product at the best price and locally where it is the best product and where it's seasonal. So yeah, the focus is on doing that. And I think from a sustainability point of view, it's about sort of changing the narrative and making sure that it's on the agenda for every supplier discussion that we have. So just as an example, this year and previous years, we write to all suppliers and ask them for their policies and their, the things that they're doing to make positive impact on sustainability. And that could be anything from the simple things of LED light bulbs right through to the way that they source products and the way that they implement the different policies across their business. So yeah, it's a major part of what we do.
Great. So thinking about diet then and the healthy eating approaches that we can adopt and inspire and encourage all of our customers and clients to work towards, can maybe Orry and Alex and yourself, Barry, please chip in any time, like maybe discuss the different dietary choices that people can make, in terms of plant-based versus meat, for example.
Shall I start?
Yeah,
okay,
go for
so within the UK, we do have guidance as to what we should be eating for a healthy and balanced diet, and that is called the Eat Well Guide. And what we know is that not many people in the UK actually follow the Eat Well Guide, less than 5%. So if they did follow the guidelines for a healthy and balanced diet, this would mean that we would have a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, we would have reductions in water use and have a more diverse land use. So it's estimated, for example, if people did shift to following the Eat Well Guide, and I'll go into more detail what that is in a minute, we would see a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 49% lower land use and 4% reduction in water use. So following the Eat Well Guide generally means that we should be eating a wide variety of fruit and vegetables, and that's at least 5 portions a day, whole grains and higher fibre starchy foods, diversifying and rebalancing protein intake towards plant protein sources, and that's what Barry mentioned there, and that would be including things like peas, beans, nuts, pulses, and some of the plant-based meat alternatives that are particularly lower in salt and saturated fat, and that would be products like tofu or mycoprotein. And then thinking about if we're reducing meat intake and reliance on animal-based products, that would also be thinking about dairy, because of course we get our milk mainly from our cows, so there's lots of dairy-free alternatives that we could be thinking there. And also we're touching on discussion this morning about salmon farming, so it's sustainably sourced fish. So that gives a sort of brief introduction, and we can give some more tips as to how to eat more sustainably at home if we've got some time later on.
Yeah, it would be great. It's really interesting when you said there, Alex, that only less than 5% of the UK population is following the Eat Well Guide. So what do you feel are the barriers to actually people following that guide?
There's many barriers, and we can only 50% of consumers consider health when they're going shopping, and less than 10% of consumers are thinking about eco-friendly. So there's the food system is really complex in the UK. We need to make many changes, and that can come from policy. We're going to see some new policy in Scotland around supporting public and private catering provisions. That's going to come in line soon. But it's also is about individual choice, about budget, about time. So there are many factors there that influence the choices we make. So we maybe see, for example, we can touch on a way to incorporate a shift towards more sustainable eating could be flexitarian eating. And we touched on that in a previous podcast. So it's having a flexible approach to plant-based eating, because I don't think we're all going to move to being vegetarian or vegan. I think that's completely unreasonable.
Yeah.
So you could dip into, meat-free Monday and make a choice, deliberate choice, to have a meat-free meal or day, and that would contribute towards a more sustainable eating habits.
Great. And Orry, then, thinking particularly of you and your role as an executive chef, and that you oversee our menus, some of which have got like 4-week menu cycles. How do you incorporate healthy eating approaches into those cycles, the Eat Well play, or how do you start to inspire our customers and clients to move towards more sustainable food choices?
I mean, I think what we do is we offer a range of options. Obviously, it's hard to force someone into eating something specific, but we do offer, whether it's we've just actually changed our sort of retail salad menu, and there is a few more options now that don't have any meat or fish in them. We used to always have a meat or a protein or something on there, but we still have protein on there, whether it's something like chickpeas, like Alex said, tofu. We've got some pure just vegetable based ones as well, but then we've got ones that have maybe got egg in it, so it is a source of protein, but it's not necessarily meat or fish. And we always have a vegetable option on as well, but it's just whether they choose to have that or not. See, in the guidelines for like the healthy eating, how much like sort of red meat do they advise to like eat in a week and stuff like that? Do they say anything about that?
So the guidelines are around making sure you are eating enough protein.
Yeah.
So and what we see is that most people in the UK do eat enough protein, because of course meat and other plant sources are providing that as a main nutrient. So what there is an upper limit of no more than 500 grams over a week period, and that's the guidance from the World Cancer Research Fund, of meat, and that's particularly emphasis on reducing processed meat, so because that's linked to colon cancer. So that's kind of, so somewhere within, we don't need to essentially eat meat every single day. We can be having reduced meat, higher quality meat products, which Entier provides, and then having alternative products as well. So it's having a range of protein options there.
Yeah, and I think also, Jen, just from a procurement point of view, because I think that overlaps as well, I think a key point there is that if there is going to be meat in the diet and in the supply chain, it's about the fact that that meat is locally sourced as well. So obviously, if you're going to buy meat from a procurement point of view, buy Scotch meat, and that has the best, in terms of sustainable impact, just because of farming practices, animal welfare, and general sort of environmental impact. So that's where we play our part in terms of that feeding into Orry and then through to customers as well.
So Barry, you've touched on Scotch beef there, and actually that's quite a core part of our ethical procurement and supplier diversity policy in terms of our Entier, and correct me if I'm wrong, 95% of the suppliers we use are local Scottish based.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I mean obviously, we've got three parts of the business. We've got RSG, which is the offshore side of the business, and that is all sourced and supplied via Strachan's or Peterhead, but behind that there's a number of local products that go into that supplier before it's consolidated and sent out. So the policy and the way that we work is consistent across all three areas, regardless of how it's consolidated and sent. You've got Fresh, which is our onshore business, which is a lot of the stuff that Orry's involved in terms of the menu development cycles for the onshore business, for the retail business. And then we've got Wild Time, which is sort of, you know, premium events business, and obviously that is very much about, you know, local high quality ingredient. So yeah, absolutely, the right the way through the core of the business, it's about local sourcing and working with Scottish suppliers and obviously Aberdeenshire suppliers where we can.
And I think what's key to that local sourcing as well is looking at, when we look at seasonal produce. So Orry, are you able to speak a bit more about the seasonal produce and actually why that makes such a significant difference in terms of the quality, but equally that environmental impact with less carbon footprint, you know, less food miles as well?
Yeah. So you shouldn't be seeing any strawberries on anyone's Christmas pudding plates, that's for sure. I think it is about using things at the right time of year when they are in season, because otherwise they're not from this country. You know, when it comes to like asparagus, you use Scottish asparagus between sort of like May and maybe July, but then if you source it out with that, it's probably coming from France or Peru or something like that. And it's the same with sort of berries as well. You should really only be using sort of raspberries and strawberries and that throughout the summer, as for they'll be imported otherwise. Yeah, and it's difficult because we live in a country, you know, there's not, you know, apart from the berries in the summer wise, you know, there isn't really a lot of fruit that's produced. So, you know, you may have to get sort of fruit from other countries. But yeah, I think it is important to use things that are in season, whether it's, you know, certain fish are in season at certain times of year, fruit, vegetables, you know, this time of year it's going to be all about sort of root vegetables, hardier vegetables, you know, like celeriac, Swedes, carrots, all that sort of things. Whereas in the summer you want to sort of definitely capitalise on all the sort of like asparagus, fresh peas, broad beans, etc. So I think it's definitely important.
And Alex touched on at the start of the podcast that, you know, we'd been talking earlier this morning about salmon farming. Yeah. So are you able to give me a bit of an insight in terms of salmon farming, why that contributes to sustainable fish, and what you learned when you had a recent visit? Yeah,
so I had a recent visit to the Back of Frost salmon farm in the Isle of Mull. So it was quite interesting because fish farming gets quite a lot of bad sort of rep, you know, because of, you know, the way they think they might do it with a lot of sort of chemicals or fuels, etc. It was quite interesting when I went out to Back of Frost and the sort of process of it all. You know, they've got the salmon eggs, and, you know, the salmon is going to be 3 or 4 years old before it actually gets harvested. But the fact that they actually don't use any chemicals, which can cause, there is the potential to lose fish by not using chemicals, but I think it's probably a better way of doing it. Well, it definitely is actually. They use smaller fish in the actual pens with the salmon to sort of eat all the lice and stuff like that. They do regular health checks on the salmon as well. So no, obviously you don't have boats going out to sea and trawling the oceans for fish. You know, you can sustainably farm them in natural waters, sort of thing.
And Alex, what's your viewpoint on that in terms of sustainable fish and salmon farming?
So the current advice is that we should be choosing fish from more sustainable sources. And then, so for consumers, we'll be looking for things like the Blue Marine Stewardship Council, the MSC logo. That'd be more on imported products, like if you look at your canned tuna, for example. Yeah. But also have a huge reliance on particular types of fish in Scotland, you know, whether it's haddock or salmon. So it should be trying to diversify and trying less familiar species, and that can help protect the fish stocks and support sustainable production methods. There are certificates that consumers can look for that provide assurance that fish has come from a well-managed and a sustainable source. And that includes, as Orry said, consideration and standards of how the stocks of both wild and farm seafood are managed. And indices of animal welfare. That is another aspect of sustainability, and that includes water quality and, as you said, the stock density of the fish. So I think it's really interesting to hear your approach and supporting sustainable and local produce and taking that through the food system to from farm, seafood farm to fork.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, Barry, you can maybe just expand a little bit on that. So although Orry is speaking about one particular area, we also work with a number of local fish suppliers up in Peterhead.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we use the Fishman in Peterhead, which is the name of the business and what he does for a living. So it's quite a nice name for the business. But we
nice
use
and simple, isn't it?
And that we buy product from there for the offshore business. So again, in terms of Entier, I think very much sort of changing what's gone before is a key thing here. You need to change. To actually make the positive change, you do need to drive some sort of significant change. And I think fresh produce in the offshore sector has been one of the major changes that Entier has done. So Entier were the first to work with fresh home-killed beef in the offshore sector. A lot of that beef that was purchased in the offshore sector before was coming from South America. It was Brazilian, Argentinian beef, and the home-killed beef obviously is coming from McWilliams in Aberdeen and prepared there, sent straight up to Strachan. So A, working locally, B, working with a Scotch product, so all the certifications and everything behind that. And obviously it's not the cheapest way for us to get that product there, but it's the right thing to do. So it's actually about driving that change. And it's the same with seafood. It's by a million miles not the easiest way to get fresh seafood offshore. The easiest thing is to buy a box of frozen fish and put it off in the box in the freezer unit. But we've actually worked with the local supplier there to put fresh seafood in sort of frozen boxes and look at frozen packs to take the product offshore. So again, our offshore customers are enjoying fresh home-killed beef, fresh locally landed seafood. And just on seafood, it's interesting because you also need to change those consumer habits, just as Alex was saying, because looking at it, the top 5 make up 80% of the products that are purchased in terms of seafood. So salmon, haddock, cod, tuna, and prawn. Whereas there's a lot of other sustainable fish out there that people could be looking at in terms of you're never going to get people away from haddock in Scotland. That a lot of people have tried and failed. But there's a lot of good sort of sustainable fish out there, like hake and sardines and different things like that you could incorporate onto menus. So you're never going to get away from haddock in the Scottish market. But we've certainly pioneered some new ways to get fresh product and local product off.
So, Barry, are you able to give us an insight in terms of plant-based approaches that we could start to incorporate into our menus, or what are we doing with our supply chain to make sure that we have plant-based options?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a massive change. I actually think if you go back a couple of years, 2019, when we were operating the various parts of the business, you had a good understanding of what the customer wanted and what the customer's dietary requirements were or purchasing habits were. I think when businesses closed down, and we were a little bit protected from that in the offshore sector because that was essential work, but in terms of our business and industries, of office buildings, you had people coming back to work that had a long period of time at home and had potentially changed. So that was a big challenge, I think, for the business, was to understand what the customer wanted when they came back. And I think you see that across everything now. I'd looked at some figures this morning, and actually one of the really interesting ones for me was that only 59% of consumers in the UK described their diet as not following any nutritional rules. So obviously that's a massive shift if you look at sort of pre and post-COVID. So what we're seeing in terms of suppliers now is we're seeing suppliers introducing a lot of new products, and a high percentage of them are plant-based or dietary to some shape or other. So there's a lot more choice out there. It makes it a lot easier for us to work on menus and get things. And we've been working with suppliers to get full lists of items that they can produce and give us, suppliers that are, plant-based, gluten-free, whatever it is, to cover all of the different bases. So I think it is a little bit easier out there now because there's a lot more choice and a lot more option.
And Orry, what's your approach to a plant-based diet? How do we incorporate that into our menus across all of the units that you're providing catering for?
I mean, I think plant-based, we do offer plant-based dishes, but it's just they're not as popular as meat-based and heavily protein-based dishes. I guess it's all about educating, is it? That's where you need to start and sort of see how you go from there. I mean, I do think I personally prefer, if I was to eat a plant-based dish, I would prefer it to actually be more sort of vegetable-based rather than like meat alternatives. That's my opinion. Not so much like tofu and stuff, but more like replica meats.
Like bacon.
Yeah, that's not
fake bacon.
Yeah, that's not for me personally. I've got the opinion it's like if you either eat bacon or you just don't eat bacon. But I mean, I guess it serves a purpose for a lot of people. It's quite interesting. I don't know the facts on it, but I guess there would be a lot of sort of processing in that sort of thing as well. I don't know if you know more about that, Alex.
So yeah, I mean, these products that are meat alternatives that are produced to look like a meat product, so the fake bacon or sausages or chicken, so they are processed, and there's a lot of discussion in social media and scientific circles about the role of ultra processing, particularly foods on and how that impacts on health. So and we should really be having a diet that is what I call whole food. So it really embraces what you're saying there, Orry, is using products, plant-based products, as they are produced rather than processing them more into a format and adding additives, salt, sugar, to make them into a product that looks like meat. So I mean, there's a lab-based meat that is the most extreme example, isn't it? Which is ridiculously expensive and is lab-grown to look like a steak. We're not there yet, in mainstream catering, but there are people who prefer to eat plant-based diet with replica products. So it serves a role there, but I eat a plant-based diet, and my preference is to avoid those products, and I would rather see the chickpeas and the vegetables mixed in together into a tasty and palatable meal.
Okay. And then thinking about diets there then, so how does sustainable and healthy eating overlap and complement each other?
That is the best question because if we follow the healthy eating advice is not always sustainable. Okay. Sustainable diets are not always healthy. And so achieving that balance of eating both healthy and sustainable is actually quite tricky. And that's perhaps one of the concepts that's confusing for consumers. So, yeah.
And you think it's confusing for consumers just due to, the communications and marketing that other companies put out there about that? Do you think the media's got a role to play there?
Yeah, the media does have a role to play in that. As a society, we need to shift more towards plant-based eating. But as a society, where we are currently is a reliance on animal products. So that is a huge shift culturally. The way that we eat, our food preferences in Scotland is our sort of meat and 2 veg, and that really is driven by probably younger generation rather than the older generation. So the way that we have eaten has changed dramatically over the last 20 years, but that has led to an increase of obesity and type 2 diabetes. So these are huge problems in how to embrace our eating patterns to promote health and well-being, but also at the same token preserve our planet for future generations. It's a complex problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, you're talking about like sustainability of food and everything like that, but I guess it's also sustainability of like employment, because of like how much jobs are created by meat-based diets, the farmers, everything in that sort of regards. So I guess, there would have to be, a contingency plan, because if we go down the route of eating less and less meat, what do we do with the other sectors and how do they go forward? So, there's a lot to sort of be considered, is there? I think what Barry was saying is if you can just, source meat locally and use local suppliers, and that's going to benefit them instead of importing and using it from other places.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I suppose if you wind back 20, 30, 40 years, we were in the UK using much more local produce. But at some point along the line, the world's become a smaller place, with transport links becoming much more accessible, and we're doing that importing more. So do you see it being, and Barry, this may be one for you as well, do you see it being that over the next couple of decades, as the UK and other countries across the world are transitioning towards net zero by 2050, do you see us going back to maybe what it was like 20, 30, 40 years ago?
I really hope that there's a way, and there's some progress made on a better way to consolidate local supply. I think as a business it's very difficult to, if you want to work with 40 producers in the Aberdeenshire area just now, you have to buy from 40 separate businesses. You have to take 40 separate invoices in. You've got to receive 40 and you've got to pay, so you've got a certain process there that restricts that from a time point of view. We've tried in the past to work with consolidators, which have, inevitably sort of failed just because of commercials. And we're working with people like Break Scotland now to work with bringing together a lot of local suppliers and then having them on the same vehicle, and you're definitely seeing a lot more backhauling. Interestingly, just Mark Murphy, our fruit and veg supplier, just in terms of the backhauling that they're doing just now, in 2022 their backhauling approach saved the equivalent of 3.6 million smartphone charges. So that's an approach that's definitely, we're starting to quantify it now, and like you say, with net zero and looking at sort of carbon neutral, there's definitely a lot more focus on how can we be more efficient, and that I think will open the door for local producers, because people will be more available to pick goods up, to do the right thing. So yeah, I really hope that it's easier for us to do more.
And one of the things, Alex, we spoke about earlier on was that there is a growing worldwide population, and that's got to be taken into consideration. So looking at food waste in particular, can you maybe talk about the importance of reducing food waste, the environmental impact that has as well?
Yes, food waste is incredibly important, and we, as an individual consumer, often we see that items that are binned because they're not used are bread and fruit and vegetables, and you go into the fridge and you find that packet of stir fry that is wilted and it just goes into the bin. So there's that component. So it's thinking ahead, meal planning, thinking about how and when you're going to use products, but also not just buying fresh products. So we can use tinned products, we can use frozen products. So these are all ways that you can kind of have your meal planning so that you have fruit and vegetables at hand to use within your meals. And then the other aspect of food waste is at home is overproducing food and then it goes in the bin. And that's economically not viable because you've wasted money in buying produce. But it would be interesting to hear your perspective in terms of what do you do with your food waste, because as an individual, then I'm quite aware of what I purchase and what is consumed at the home, but you're doing it at a much bigger level.
Yeah, and I think, Orry, you're the perfect person to answer this in terms of what are approaches to reducing food waste in the business and what particularly you're doing when you're planning the meals out to ensure that there's minimal waste and how we measure it all.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is it's like overproducing and engaging what you're using. I think we've probably got into this habit of, like, especially on retail side of things, thinking that like the shelves always need to be full. I think, we had a conversation within the business not too long ago about saying, order less, let it run out, and if it's a case of giving people less options, that's better than, having so much left over. I think it's definitely, when you look at the likes of supermarkets and stuff like that, the amount of things that will, get thrown out because they've not been purchased. I know there's a few schemes down in London where there's apps that you can go on at like sort of 5-6 o'clock at night, and it's actually what is going out of date that day that they'll sell to you that evening for very cheap. So like,
Oh yeah, I've got that app.
Yeah.
Actually, I downloaded it.
Too Good to Go.
Too Good. Yeah, it's called Too Good to Go. So my friend was actually just up from London. He could get like sushi for like a sixth of the price at like 7 o'clock at night that has to be consumed that day. I think it's good that there is things like that happening. Probably needs to be more of that, especially up here. I mean, I feel like we're kind of like the last to get everything, in the sense of things actually coming up to the north of Scotland. But I think things like that are important. And I think as well, just actually putting any sort of food waste in a food waste bin and not in, a lot of people don't want to have a sort of compost bin in their house, the smell and et cetera, but I think it is important that it's not going into landfill, because obviously the gases that come off it as well, and actually realising that it's not just food that can go into a compost bin. It is sort of like, cocktail sticks, certain types of paper, egg cartons, that sort of thing that can all sort of break down. So I think that's our approach. We obviously try to reduce waste at all costs when we're prepping in the kitchen, you know what I mean? If you've got like, tops of tomatoes that have the eye in it, that's got to go into like tomato sauces, tomato soups, where it can actually be used and not just put into food waste bins.
And I think as well, Alex, particularly looking at our offshore part of the business as well, is over the last few years we've reduced our food waste by over 50%. So that means, well, it's got a monetary value as well to benefit our clients too. So we're very conscious of that, and we've actually got a fantastic food waste reduction programme with some really strong goals and objectives that we look to achieve as a business.
I think planning is definitely the most important part in reducing. If you plan like anything, you'll do a better job, with planning. Yeah. So if you plan what you're going to use and work it out, then you're going to purchase less.
From a hospitality perspective as well, I think that hospitality is an industry that's been over-serviced for so long, and I think what we've tried to do is, I guess it's like you said, Alex, it's a complicated, complex sort of dynamic between healthy eating and sustainability. It's probably the same in terms of food waste as well, because you could just order every day from every supplier and try and reduce your food waste, but obviously from a sustainability point of view, that would increase the number of food miles, or increase the number of deliveries, the time that we spent on things, the resource. So we do try to cut down the number of deliveries, work as locally as we can, and it's planning, isn't it? It comes into the same thing, Orry.
Yeah, definitely.
So we slightly touched on some of the challenges and the barriers earlier on. What would be your top tips and solutions for people to adopt a more environmental, sustainable and healthy eating approach?
So I've got a few jotted down, so I'll share them. So we can all reduce our carbon footprint and help our planet by, and this is recapping what we've discussed already, so reducing red meat and having some meat-free days every week. So eating more plant foods, reducing food wastes, moderating our intake of high-fat dairy products, eat more fruits and vegetables, eat locally, particularly when in season, avoid eating more than is needed, especially when we're eating treats, swapping out animal proteins for plant-based ones, choosing whole grains, which is better for our health, for dietary fibre, choosing sustainably sourced seafood, eating dairy products in moderation, avoiding unnecessary packaging, and drinking more tap water.
Great. Orry, anything to add to that?
Buy a whole chicken. Learn how to bone out a chicken. This isn't for the plant-based, but I think if you buy a whole chicken, you could get 5 meals out of it. One chicken. That's what I think. That's what I always do. If you think about using less meat as well, I think you can get a meal per breast. You can get a meal for the 2 thighs, the 2 drumsticks. You can use the carcass to make a chicken broth, chicken soup, chicken noodle soup. That's 5 meals. What I tend to do is buy a whole chicken, bone it out, freeze down the parts that you don't want to use straight away, instead of going and buying, everyone buys these chicken breasts, skinless, in packs. They can cost a lot. I think if you can spend £11 on a free range chicken, corn fed, free range, something like that from the supermarket, and actually, it's like these things can go further. It's not just one meal.
Yeah. I have a feeling we'll need to do a cook along with Orry there, so that you can demonstrate to people.
It's actually very easy. It's very easy to do, and yeah, I think there's a tip.
And then I suppose would your other tip be, if you plant-based diet, not using the processed?
Yeah, I mean, I
fake
actually do eat a few vegetarian meals a week. Sometimes a lot of the time not on purpose, whether it's a pasta dish with like butternut squash, spinach, but then obviously if you can add meat to it, but a lot of the time, I don't. I'd much prefer to have something that's plant-based rather than buy the processed alternatives. I think sometimes the ingredient lists on the back of them are quite scary. A lot of the time it's hard to identify what you're actually eating.
And Barry, have you got any top tips from an environmental sustainability perspective?
Yeah, I think one's probably just to elaborate on one of the points that Alex made, obviously, around buying local and seasonal. It's probably just understanding where the product comes from, because I think sometimes it can be difficult to really understand. You think you're maybe doing good by buying some fresh fruit and veg, but obviously things like fine beans and sugar snaps, they tend to be air freighted quite a high percentage of the year, so they actually are probably on the naughty list when it comes to what you should be buying. Obviously there's things there, simple tips which I'm really guilty of is obviously remembering to bring your own bags, and one that I was always told was don't shop when you're hungry, because you always tend to buy a lot of stuff that you don't actually really need. So it comes into that sort of planning. Obviously you can look for other things there, fair trade products as well, which is sustainability in a different way. Obviously it's looking at sustainability of farming and making sure that the farms can continue to produce the goods. And obviously I think the key thing is you don't have to do it all. I think if you look at all of the statistics here, if the whole population makes one small change, it's going to make much more difference than a minority making all of the changes. So, just incorporate small changes. You don't have to do everything overnight. So just get into the habits of doing things differently.
That's great. And before we wrap up, is there anything that any of you would like to add, or any comments, thoughts, opinions?
Can I read out the FAO definition of what a sustainable diet is?
Yes.
So, because I've got that in front of me. So, sustainable diets are those diets with low environmental impacts which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems and are culturally accessible, and fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, while optimising our bioresources.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, so thank you so much for all being part of the podcast today. And don't forget that you can follow us on social media. So you'll find us at Facebook at Entier Services and on Instagram at Entier Limited.